Welcome to week 2 of Montessori philosophy. If you look at your syllabus, you'll find that you already have your discussion thread suggestions for your online communication with your fellow students and with me. And hopefully you're keeping up with your reading because you do have all of your reading assignments already. I'm going to give you a quick overview of our next subject for reading and writing, which is called the absorbent mind, the formative period. Montessori was what we call a stage theorist, much like Sigmund Freud, Jean Piaget, Erik Erikson, and Vygotsky, who was actually a constructionist, but thought very much like these stage theorists. And although we're going to be focusing on the first 6 years of a child's life, I'm going to give you a small overview of what Montessori called the planes of development, sometimes the planes of education, but they were really about the planes of development. And she had ideas about how every child, although every child is a distinct individual, matures, progresses, and finds who they are over their lifetime, so that ultimately they make the best use of the genetic and environmental gifts they're given to make the most significant contribution to all the communities that they may touch in life. And she had theories from the time of birth and even before birth until the child became about 24. Now we're looking at maybe 30 for people coming through their fourth plane. I'll emphasize the first 6 years because that's really the subject of your writing and reading for this week. The first plane of development was from 0 to 6. It was called early childhood to her, and she had a overall kind of label for it. It was called the formative period, but the chief characteristic of it was what was called the absorbent mind, the belief that it is not the teacher or the parents who cause growth in children. It's the children themselves, driven by their inner gifts, something that strangely Montessori called horm, which is a kind of an antiquated word, but later you will find that it works quite well. In the 0 to 6 early childhood plane of development, was broken down into 2 periods, 0 to 3 and 3 to 6. 0 to 3 was called the unconscious absorption of the environment, meaning that the child at that time in his life really isn't thinking about what they're doing. Obviously, kids develop routines for doing things. They know how to interact with the environment to make things happen, but they're kind of unconscious explorers. Every single thing that happens does get stored in their brain as something that used to be called an engram in the olden days and can be drawn upon because it becomes lodged in the unconscious, the subconscious part of the mind, and can later be retrieved. But children essentially in that 0 to 3 time really don't have a memory of things that are happening. They're building some memories, but they can't use those memories, not until they're 2.5 to 3 years old. So during that time, the child is like a machine, just exploring the environment, seeing how things react when they touch them, and taking in all this information, learning how to deal with their world. That includes their home, if they are in an infant toddler program, that community, wherever. And they are gathering lots and lots of information. But it's all done unconsciously, so that's called the unconscious absorption of the environment. At about 2.5 or 3 years old, up until 6 years old, the child begins to say, hey, I have experiences. I know what they mean. I know what to do with them. I can apply them. Montessori referred to that as the validation of the will. The child saying, I am now going to deliberately plan and affect my environment. From that point on, all of these sensorial experiences that the child has by interacting with the environment, and by the way, they learn everything by using their bodies to interact with the environment. They never sit back and just contemplate. Primarily their mouth, their hands, their entire body is constantly in motion to interact and push against that environment and get feedback from it. So, at about 2.5 or 3, in the conscious absorption of the environment, the child begins to actually plot and to say, I'm learning systems. Still, every experience they have is internalized, and they can later retrieve it. They may not be able to articulate everything, but the unconscious mind, the subconscious, is organizing all this information for them so that it can be used later. And they will continue to interact vigorously. And there are some important things called sensitive periods that we'll talk more about later next week that are a part of this. So that period, the formative period from 0 to 6, is very important. That's what we'll be concentrating on mostly within this course. Later on, children move into the second plane of development, which is roughly 6 to 12 years of age, where kids really become kind of consolidated. They're really healthy. They're really focused on learning about the world around them. We provide curriculum in the classroom for them. They choose the things they're interested in, and they just run with them. They're really interested in finding out about their friends. We talk about young boys about age 5 on running in herds. They're into hero worship, into each other. But 6 to 12 is a great time to provide what we call the cultural curriculum in Montessori, where we're giving certain presentations, inviting children into studying certain subjects, and then facilitating for them, which is the whole deal in Montessori. Facilitating for the interests of the child and trusting that they will become well educated in that process. Montessori also spent quite a bit of time thinking and theorizing and trying to set up schools for children from 12 to 18, and she called that period of life adolescence. And she broke it down into two, again, like the early childhood time, and in some ways, these 12 to 18-year-olds are a lot like the 0 to 6-year-olds. She actually called them neonates because of some of the same issues that occur for teenagers that you are probably familiar with if you have older children or been around them. But from that time, Montessori had this idea that may seem a little strange. It has happened, and it's working well in a number of schools around the country, where children actually boarded away from home during much of the year, and perhaps as much as 3 years, and would make visits back home. But they were with a nurturing adult who was not a parent, living communally. And because Montessori children generally have the equivalent education of a high school graduate by the time they're 12 years old, and they're not all that interested in academics typically in high school, this is a good time for them to get on-the-job training, to experiment with the real world and get feedback from nurturing adults. Work through interpersonal relationships, emotions, all of those things that you all know happen during high school, when parents seemed like aliens perhaps. But eventually they all came home appreciating their parents and their homes a lot more in this process. But she was so busy with the 0 to 12 ages that she didn't have as much time to spend with that theory. And then she finished up with what we call young adulthood, which is from 18 to 24. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, that period of young adulthood in our age, because things have changed radically since Montessori passed away in 1952, is frequently stretched out to as old as 30, when you find that your children come home to roost while they're trying to find their place in the world. During that time, 18 to 24, in Montessori's planes of development, it's a time for the consolidation of values and emotions, finding one's place in the community and in the world of work, establishing lifetime relationships, which was really an expectation back then. We have a little different concept sometimes now. And settling into life's patterns that will hold fairly true until they become elderly. That's just an overview of the 4 planes of development. We will be focusing mostly upon the first plane of development. A little bit about next week's writing assignment, which will be on the absorbent mind in the formative periods. Here are some things to think about. Do your reading, articulate your understanding of the dynamics of the 0 to 3 period, the unconscious absorption of the environment, and 3 to 6, the stages of the absorbent mind. look at them and see what distinguishes 0 to 3 from 3 to 6. Think about what will is and the onset of memory and how that affects the difference between those two periods within that plane. And think about the implications. What implications does the absorbent mind model have for you as a parent or as a facilitator? How would that affect the way you interact with children from now on? Thank you.